This is probably what comes to mind when you think of New York City. But this bustling metropolis is also home to more than 30,000 acres of this. Parks are a critical part of New York City's lifeblood. They serve as a way to cool us down on hot days and provide the much-needed space to exercise and escape from the daily grind.
We could think of Central Park as the green lung of New York City.
A lot of times we take our parks for granted, but imagine if we didn't have them. Where would the relief be?
The city's parks need constant maintenance.
The average New York City park is 73 years old. The needs are growing. The pace at which parks can maintain those things has not kept up.
And some fall into years of disrepair.
This park in this community has experienced decades of intentional disinvestment and neglect.
New parks are popping up in the most unexpected of places, and city planners are designing for an unknown future.
The only place left to build open space tends to be old infrastructure.
Here is how parks keep New York City breathing.
We have this rectangle in the center of our grid. You just see green in the middle of all the buildings, loaded with birds, wildlife, plants, so much life here. You come to Central Park, you can look long and far, and there's something really relaxing about that.
With nearly 42 million visitors a year, Central Park is the most visited urban park in the United States. Its 26 ball fields, ice skating rinks, tennis courts, and miles of bike lanes and running paths provide countless opportunities for New Yorkers' health.
The park originally was constructed because of health issues, and 150 years later, that still remains present to this day.
The green, the plants, the space, the openness, the views, the sky, all of that really does help our mental well-being, our emotional well-being, and of course, our physical well-being.
Parks are a central part of any city or town, and they have been so for centuries. New York's first official park dates all the way back to 1733. Bowling Green Park, a small patch of land at the tip of Manhattan, was leased to 3 men for a peppercorn. The park featured a statue of King George III and an iron fence, which still stands today. An angry mob would later tear down the statue in 1776. Over the next few decades, parks would continue to pop up around the growing city, specifically below Canal Street. That was until 1811, when these 3 men were commissioned to design a system that would forever change the face of the city. Their plan, outlined on a map more than 8 feet long, called for a massive grid, 12 avenues wide, 155 streets long. But there was one glaring omission: public park space. It wasn't until 1853 when the city used eminent domain to claim more than 700 acres and began construction on what at the time was the largest space of its kind in America. This tragically included Seneca Village, a settlement made up of mostly African-American landowners. The city held a contest, and the Greensward Plan, submitted by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, won out. The plan called for a more natural design to the park. The intended effect was to transport park-goers out of the city to somewhere more like upstate New York. Olmsted called the park New York's antithesis to its bustling paved rectangular walled-in streets. While most of the ways parks help sustain the city and its people are obvious, parks also serve a hidden purpose that is just as important.
All these benefits that parks provide, we start to see them as not simply a thing that's just nice to have, but a critical piece of the urban infrastructure. We could think of Central Park as the green lung of New York City. Central Park is going to be a cool oasis in the midst of Manhattan. All the plants and trees, they're going to cool off. They're going to cool off the area. They're going to give us shade, provide oxygen, soak up, filter, break down pollution, and they're going to cool off the ambient temperature.
New York summers are hot, and they are only getting hotter. But why does the hottest day in New York feel all the more suffocating? Well, because it is. It's called the heat island effect. It's what happens in large urban areas where there is little to no vegetation. In New York, roads absorb 90% of the sun's radiation and increase the temperatures in the surrounding area, even after the sun goes down. Here's where parks come in. They act as a cooling agent of sorts.
You think of Manhattan, you think of New York City, concrete, asphalt, lots of stone, the human-built environment, skyscrapers. Those are all things we think of in New York City. Now, all of those things are going to absorb the solar radiation from the sun. And it's going to soak up a lot of heat and hold on to that heat, too, through its thermal mass. So if you're standing out on a New York City block, you're going to really feel that heat.
Take Central Park, for instance. The park's massive tree canopies act as nature's umbrella.
They go through a process known as evapotranspiration, which cools off the ambient temperature around us. When all the water that's soaked up through the plants and it goes up through the roots, through the trunk of the tree, evaporates through the leaves, it's going to cool off the surrounding air.
Just as New York is expected to have hotter summers, the frequency of intense storms is also projected to increase.
Central Park and all the parks around New York City, they act as a sort of sponge and soak up stormwater. All these surfaces that we call impermeable surfaces, so all the asphalt, the concrete, the stone, these things are impermeable, meaning that they cannot absorb rainwater and stormwater. And all the rain, whenever it rains and whenever it storms, all that rain, stormwater runoff, would collect that much more debris and pollution from the ground as it runs off into the East River, into the Hudson River. Without a Central Park and without our green spaces, we would have so much more rainwater and stormwater runoff accumulating and be so much more prone to flooding.
Today, about 7,000 workers are responsible for keeping the city's parks up and running. Eli Dvorkin is the editorial and policy director at the Center for an Urban Future. In a report from 2018, the center found that 20% of the city's parks have not seen any major infrastructure improvements in 25 years.
Our organization estimates that something like $6 billion will be needed to fully upgrade the city's parks systems, core systems. One of the key issues with parks infrastructure is that those maintenance problems compound into big, thorny, and expensive problems.
But this work is expensive, and while some parks have the luxury of conservancies that allow for extra care and maintenance, many of New York's most vulnerable parks have only the city to rely on. The city's Anchor Parks initiative has put millions of dollars into parks that are in desperate need of repair. The city's Anchor Parks initiative is expected to continue, and the park's budget has stabilized since taking a hit during the pandemic. But in a city as dense as New York, creativity is often the key to finding new ways to develop parks.
When we first came up here, it was just magical. It was like a mile and a half of wildflowers, and you know, the nature had just reclaimed these old railroad tracks.
In the late 90s, after decades of neglect, the elevated train tracks that were once used to cart food in and out of the city were languishing. Then Mayor Rudy Giuliani signed the demolition order, and the tracks were to come down. That was until Robert Hammond and Joshua David founded Friends of the High Line in an attempt to save it.
To me, it was this reminder of this industrial past. Love this juxtaposition of sort of hard and soft, nature, man-made, industrial, ugly and beautiful. And that's when I felt like it would be a real crime to tear it down. A lot of people think this was an old L, which was the old elevated subways, but this was a freight line. This was, it was nicknamed the lifeline of New York because it was mainly carrying food in and out of New York.
The structure was saved, but it wasn't until much later that the idea to turn it into a park came about.
And it was really through a lot of community input that people said what they wanted was a park. People really said, we want it to be nature. And this neighborhood, because it was originally an industrial neighborhood, had very little open space, very little park space. So that people also really wanted that in their neighborhood. This is meant to be part of the city. You see it. I mean, you can hear it right now. You can hear jackhammers, traffics, ambulances. It never gets really quiet up here. And you can smell it. You can see it. And to me, that's why people are drawn to it. Is sometimes some parks you could be in and you could be anywhere in the country, where here you could only be in New York City. I think what people really respond to is keeping that history, keeping that old infrastructure, and creating new uses for it. And so, because to me, that's what gives, you know, neighborhoods a texture. Not just tearing down infrastructure, but reusing it and keeping parts. Like, that's why we put the rails back in, you know, so you can see the train tracks and you can have some, you know, memory of the neighborhood.
Parks will continue to evolve with New Yorkers into the next century. Whether they are cooling you down on a hot day or getting your heart rate up on the track, parks will forever be critical to New Yorkers' lives.
We have neighborhood parks all over, and they're all wonderful, and we need them all. We need to be able to step out of our house and quickly get to a green space.
Parks for the city. It's funny, I always, like, when I walk into the park, it's almost like my Narnia. Like, it's almost like this majestic, magical place in the city.